The morning sunlight filtered through the large, spotless windows of the Miller family restaurant, casting warm, golden hues over the wooden floorboards that had been worn smooth by years of bustling customers and staff. In the heart of the cozy kitchen, Chef David Miller was immersed in his morning routine, a scene of controlled chaos that he had perfected over the past decade. David adjusted the crisp white chef's coat that he wore with pride. On the front, just above his heart, was the logo he had designed himself, a simple yet meaningful depiction of a fork and spoon crossed in the middle, symbolizing the marriage of traditional American comfort food with his unique creative flair. This wasn't just a logo to David. It was a tribute to his late parents, who had always believed in his culinary dreams. "Myra, the potatoes need more salt," David called out, his voice cutting through the kitchen noise like a conductor fine-tuning an orchestra. "Yes, chef," Myra replied, instantly grabbing the small jar of seasoning that David had spent years perfecting. The jar was nearly iconic in its own right, a blend of spices that David had crafted through endless trial and error. Myra moved quickly, sprinkling the mixture evenly over a steaming tray of roasted potatoes, her movements precise and practiced. The Miller family restaurant wasn't fancy by any stretch of the imagination. Located in the heart of Houston, Texas, it was housed in a modest, renovated wooden house that had once belonged to David's grandparents. With its mismatched chairs, warm earth-tone walls, and handwritten menu boards, it exuded a charm that was both nostalgic and inviting. Yet, for the local community, this small, unassuming restaurant was more than just a place to eat. It was a gathering spot, a second home, a symbol of resilience and togetherness. David had poured everything he had into this place, his savings, his time, and his heart. After his parents passed away, he had decided to honor their memory by opening a restaurant that reflected their values: good food, hard work, and community. Over the past 10 years, the restaurant had grown into a beloved cornerstone of the neighborhood, drawing families, friends, and even strangers who quickly became regulars. "Dad, the Hendersons just confirmed their dinner reservation for tonight," came a cheerful voice from the doorway. David looked up to see his 16-year-old daughter, Emma, standing with her hands on her hips, her face framed by loose strands of hair escaping her ponytail. Despite her young age, Emma had taken to the restaurant business like she'd been born for it. She loved interacting with customers, managing the reservations, and, much to David's pride, had started experimenting with cooking herself. "They're celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary, right?" David asked, a smile spreading across his face. He immediately thought of Mrs. Henderson's favorite dessert, a classic apple pie that he had baked countless times for her over the years. "That's right," Emma said with a grin. "Should I add it to the menu for tonight?" "Absolutely," David said with a nod. "And make sure to let them know it's on the house. A little something special for them to celebrate." Emma gave him a thumbs up before heading back out to the front of the house, already jotting a note in the reservation book. David couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he watched her. She reminded him so much of her mother, who had always been the heart and soul of this place before she passed away years ago. The kitchen hummed along like a well-tuned orchestra, every member of the team moving in sync. The sizzle of pans filled the air with the mouth-watering aroma of breakfast dishes, while knives rhythmically chopped vegetables on wooden cutting boards. Occasionally, a voice would cut through the symphony with a call of "behind" as staff navigated the narrow workspace. David thrived in this environment. To him, the kitchen wasn't just a place of work, it was his sanctuary, a place where he could channel his creativity and passion into something tangible. As he prepared a fresh batch of pancake batter, David's thoughts wandered. This restaurant had become so much more than he'd ever dreamed. The locals loved the food, but it was the atmosphere they cherished most, a sense of belonging that was becoming increasingly rare in a fast-paced, disconnected world. He'd overheard countless customers refer to the restaurant as Miller's Kitchen instead of its official name, and he didn't mind. It felt right, like family. "Chef, we're out of the special maple syrup," Myra called out, bringing him back to reality. "Check the back pantry," David replied, already calculating how much syrup they would need to get through the breakfast rush. Just as he was about to dive back into the pancake batter, Emma's voice rang out again, louder this time and tinged with urgency. "Dad." David turned, immediately alert. "What is it, Emma?" "There's a call for you," Emma said, her tone serious. She held out the phone, her expression unusually tense. "It's from someone at Trump Tower." David froze, the spatula in his hand hovering over the griddle. "Trump Tower?" he repeated, his brows furrowing. "They want to book the entire restaurant for tomorrow night," Emma said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "For him." The bustling kitchen seemed to fall into an uneasy silence, all eyes subtly shifting toward David. The weight of the words hung in the air like a heavy fog. David felt a strange mixture of disbelief and irritation settling in his chest. "Donald Trump? Here?" he asked, his voice low but incredulous. Emma nodded. "They're offering to pay double the normal rate," she added cautiously, as if sensing the storm brewing in her father's mind. David wiped his hands on his apron, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the phone in Emma's hand, the gears in his mind already turning. He didn't have an answer yet, but he could feel the entire kitchen holding its breath, waiting for his next move. "Chef, the produced delivery is here." Mark, the new sous chef, called out from the back door, his voice slightly louder than necessary in the bustling kitchen. "But there's an issue with the tomatoes." David Miller, standing by the griddle flipping golden pancakes with expert precision, sighed deeply and set down his spatula. He wiped his hands on his apron, a reflexive gesture more out of habit than necessity, and headed toward the back door. "Let me guess," he said as he reached Mark, already pulling open the nearest box. "They're not the organic ones we ordered again." His tone was more resigned than angry. This wasn't the first time the supplier had made mistakes. Mark nodded sheepishly. "Yeah, it's the standard greenhouse stuff. That's 3 times this month." David frowned, inspecting the shiny, too perfect tomatoes inside the box. "These won't work," he muttered, more to himself than to Mark. "Call them. Tell them we need the right order delivered by noon, or we'll find someone else." He turned back toward the kitchen, but before he could take 2 steps, Emma's voice rang out from the front of the house. "Dad," she called, her tone sharp and urgent. David stopped mid-step, immediately alert. Emma rarely used that tone unless something was seriously wrong. He pivoted and made his way quickly to the reception desk, weaving through the bustling kitchen with practiced ease. "What's going on?" he asked as he approached. Emma stood behind the counter, clutching the phone so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Her face was pale, and her usually confident demeanor had given way to unease. "Dad," she said quietly, her voice almost trembling. "Someone from Trump Tower just called." David's brow furrowed. "Trump Tower?" Emma nodded, swallowing hard. "They want to book the entire restaurant for tomorrow night for him." David froze in place, the weight of her words settling over him like a thick fog. "Donald Trump? Here?" Emma nodded again, hesitating before continuing. "They said they'd pay double the usual rate." Her voice softened, as though she were bracing for her father's reaction. The kitchen noise seemed to die down as if the entire staff had sensed the tension brewing. David's reputation as a staunch advocate for immigrant rights and his outspoken criticism of certain policies were well known. Many of his staff had been hired not just for their skills, but because they, too, shared in the struggles he often spoke about, struggles he had lived through with his own parents. David took a deep breath and reached for the phone. "This is Chef Miller speaking," he said, his voice steady but edged with irritation. On the other end, a polite, professional voice replied, "Good morning, Chef. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Trump regarding a private event. We've heard wonderful things about your restaurant." And David didn't let the caller finish. "I don't care what you've heard or what he wants," he interrupted, his tone sharp and unyielding. "This restaurant does not serve him." There was a brief pause on the other end, and when the voice returned, it was still calm but slightly more insistent. "Chef, I understand your concerns, but I think you should reconsider. We're prepared to offer." "Not a chance," David snapped, his voice rising with each word. The entire kitchen fell silent. Staff members exchanged nervous glances but kept their heads down, not daring to speak or move too much. David slammed the phone down with a loud clatter, his frustration boiling over. He ripped off his apron, the fabric landing in a heap on the counter, and ran a hand through his hair, exhaling heavily. "Everyone, back to work," he barked, his voice echoing in the suddenly quiet kitchen. His staff quickly resumed their tasks, their movements more cautious than before. David turned toward Emma, who was still standing behind the counter, her eyes wide. He softened his tone slightly, though his words carried the same firm resolve. "We've got meals to cook. Emma, let's focus on the people who matter." Emma hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her expression a mix of concern and admiration for her father's unwavering principles. As David walked back into the kitchen, the tension in the air slowly began to dissipate, but the lingering weight of what had just happened was palpable. David tried to refocus on his work, but his mind churned. The request, the offer, and his decision hung over him like a storm cloud. For better or worse, the restaurant was his sanctuary, a place built on the values he held dear. And in this moment, those values had spoken louder than any price tag ever could. That day, David couldn't focus. The kitchen buzzed around him, the familiar clatter of pots and pans, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, and the calls of "behind" as staff moved past one another. Normally, this symphony of activity grounded him, a welcome distraction from the outside world. But not today. The morning's call from Donald Trump's team played on a loop in his mind. Their offer, his emphatic refusal, it all left him unsettled, even angry. David wasn't one to second-guess himself, but something about this particular interaction gnawed at him. He tried to push the thoughts aside as he prepped for the dinner rush, but they clung to him like an unwelcome guest. "Dad," Emma's voice rang out from the front of the house, sharp and breathless. David looked up from the cutting board where he had been dicing onions with mechanical precision. "What is it?" he asked, a note of concern creeping into his voice. "There's an elderly woman waiting outside," Emma said, pausing to catch her breath. "She says she needs to talk to you about Mr. Trump." David frowned, wiping his hands on his apron. "About him," he muttered, his voice tinged with irritation. Setting his knife down, he reluctantly made his way toward the front. When he stepped into the reception area, he saw her immediately, a small, elderly woman standing near the counter, her hands clasped tightly around a worn photograph. She wore a neatly pressed gray cardigan over a simple blouse, her silver hair swept back in a tidy bun. Despite her fragile appearance, there was something resolute in her posture, a quiet strength that made David pause. "Hello, sir," she said as he approached, her voice soft but steady. "Can I help you?" David asked, his tone cautious but polite. "My name is Margaret Wilson," she began, offering a small, tired smile. "I worked for the Trump family many years ago." David raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "What can I do for you, Ms. Wilson?" Instead of answering immediately, Margaret placed the photograph on the counter between them. David leaned in to get a better look. The picture was old, its edges worn and slightly yellowed. In it, a young woman, Margaret in her youth, stood in a small kitchen, her arm draped lovingly around a grinning blonde boy holding up a freshly baked apple pie. "This is Donald," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of nostalgia and sadness. "He was 7 years old then. His mother was often ill, in and out of the hospital. I took care of him for years." David stared at the photo, struggling to reconcile the innocent, joyful child in the image with the powerful, polarizing figure he knew today. "And this has to do with me how? Exactly?" he asked, folding his arms across his chest. Margaret looked up at him, her steady gaze meeting his. "I know you don't hold a favorable opinion of Mr. Trump," she said gently. "I understand why, but I need you to hear my story, a story very few people know." David didn't respond, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to continue. Margaret took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. "30 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer," she began, her voice distant as if she were recalling a long-buried memory. "By that time, I had already left the Trump family. I was living alone, with no insurance, no savings, and no hope." David's expression softened slightly as he listened, sensing the weight of what she was about to share. "One day, I got a call from a lawyer," Margaret continued. "To my surprise, it turns out Donald, the boy in this photo, had paid for all my medical expenses, quietly, without fanfare. He even set up a fund to make sure I wouldn't have to worry about anything until I recovered." David's brow furrowed. He hadn't expected this. "I asked him why," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "And he told me, 'Maggie, you took care of me when I needed it most. This is my way of giving back.'" She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He never told anyone, not his family, not his friends. It was just something he did because it felt right." David shifted his weight, the tension in his chest growing. The story was simple, heartfelt, and undeniably genuine. It painted a picture of Donald Trump that was difficult to reconcile with the man David thought he knew. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, his voice measured but curious. Margaret placed her hand on the photograph, her expression softening. "I don't have much time left, Chef Miller. The doctors tell me I only have a few months." She paused, taking another deep breath. "The last thing I want before I leave this world is to share a meal with Donald, one last dinner. Not as a politician and a stranger, but as the little boy I once cared for and the woman who loved him like her own." David stood there, frozen, unsure of how to respond. Part of him wanted to dismiss her request outright, to cling to the principles that had guided his decision earlier that morning. But another part of him, the part that saw the frailty in her posture, the quiet determination in her voice, hesitated. "You want me to cook that meal?" he said slowly, his tone heavy with hesitation. Margaret nodded, her smile faint but sincere. "I'm not asking you to do this for Donald Trump," she said. "I'm asking you to do it for an old woman who wants to relive a small, beautiful piece of her past before it's too late." David stared at her for a long moment, his emotions swirling. Her words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Finally, he exhaled deeply, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. "I need some time to think," he said quietly. Margaret didn't push him. She simply smiled again, this time with a hint of sadness, and slowly stood with the help of her companion. As she reached the door, she turned back to look at him, her gaze steady and full of quiet conviction. "The boy in that photo isn't perfect," she said. but he's done good things that many others wouldn't. And sometimes, those things deserve to be remembered. David remained rooted to the spot long after she left. Her story, her words, and that photograph echoed in his mind, challenging everything he thought he knew. As he returned to the kitchen, the weight of her request settled over him. Could he put aside his personal feelings, his principles, to do something not for politics, but simply for humanity? That question followed him for the rest of the day, whispering in the back of his mind like a quiet but persistent wind. That night, David sat in the quiet solitude of his small office, a single lamp casting a soft glow on the cluttered desk in front of him. Amid the scattered papers and notebooks lay the old photograph Margaret had left behind. It was frayed at the edges, but the image it held was vivid, an innocent young boy, his golden hair slightly messy, grinning ear to ear as he proudly held an apple pie. David couldn't stop staring at it. The boy in the photo wasn't the Donald Trump he thought he knew. He wasn't the larger-than-life public figure whose name evoked such strong feelings in people. No, this boy was simply a child, happy, carefree, and full of promise. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Margaret's words lingered in his thoughts. Sometimes, love is the secret ingredient that's missing from the recipe. It was such a simple sentiment, yet it carried a profound truth that resonated with him. David had spent years building his restaurant not just as a place for people to eat, but as a haven, a place where the community could gather, share stories, and feel at home. His parents had always told him that food had the power to connect people, to bridge divides. But now, he found himself questioning whether he could live up to those ideals when it mattered most. The night stretched on, the stillness of the restaurant amplifying his internal debate. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the windows, David had made his decision. He didn't feel entirely at peace with it, but he knew it was the right thing to do. The following morning, David entered the kitchen, his usual warmth now coupled with a quiet determination that filled the room. "Tonight," he began, gathering his team around him, "we're preparing a very special dinner. Not for money, not for recognition, but for something bigger, for a story of memory and humanity." The staff exchanged glances, their initial surprise giving way to a shared sense of purpose. They had worked with David long enough to know that when he set his mind to something, it was always for a reason that mattered. That afternoon, Margaret arrived at the restaurant, her steps slow but steady as she was helped inside by her companion. Despite her frailty, there was a certain light in her eyes that hadn't been there the day before, a glimmer of excitement and hope. In her hands, she carried an old apron, its fabric faded and softened by decades of use. "I wore this apron every Sunday when I cooked for Donald and his family," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly as she extended it to David. "He always called it the lucky apron. He said that whenever I wore it, the food tasted even better." David took the apron from her hands, his fingers brushing over the worn fabric. It was dotted with faint stains that no amount of washing could erase. But to David, it was perfect. "I'll wear it tonight," he said quietly, "and I'll make this meal with all the love and respect you put into it back then." Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you, Chef Miller," she whispered. By the time 7 p.m. rolled around, the restaurant was buzzing with quiet anticipation. Outside, the flash of cameras lit up the street as reporters jostled for a view of Donald Trump's motorcade. Protesters and supporters lined the sidewalks, their voices muffled by the thick walls of the restaurant. Inside, the atmosphere was calm and warm, an oasis of tranquility amid the chaos. The dim lighting cast a golden glow over the wooden tables, each one meticulously set with gleaming silverware and freshly polished glasses. When Trump entered the restaurant, His usual air of confidence was noticeably subdued. His gaze immediately landed on Margaret, who was waiting for him at a table near the window. "Maggie," he said softly, his voice carrying an emotion that surprised even himself. Margaret rose slowly, tears already brimming in her eyes. "Donnie," she replied with a gentle smile, "you haven't changed much, still as tall as ever." Trump chuckled quietly, a rare, unguarded moment. "And you," he said, his voice catching slightly, "you're still Maggie." He leaned down and embraced her gently, his hands resting on her frail shoulders as though afraid she might break. The room seemed to hold its breath, the staff watching from a respectful distance as this private moment played out. In the kitchen, David tied Margaret's apron around his waist, the fabric fitting snugly over his chef's coat. He felt the weight of the moment, not just the expectations, but the history and emotion behind it. The Sunday roast was plated with care, each element arranged with precision. The meat glistened under the light, cooked to a perfect medium rare, while the roasted vegetables nestled beside it, their caramelized edges hinting at the sweetness within. A rich, glossy gravy was drizzled over the top, pooling slightly at the edges of the plate. David carried the dish out himself, his steps measured and steady. When he reached the table, he placed the plate in front of Trump and Margaret, his voice calm and steady as he said, "Sunday roast, made from Margaret's recipe. I hope it's everything you remember." Trump stared at the dish for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he picked up his fork and knife, cutting a small piece, and brought it to his mouth. As he chewed, his face softened, his eyes closing briefly as though he were savoring not just the flavor, but a long-forgotten memory. "This," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "this is exactly as I remember. It's like being back in Maggie's kitchen all those years ago." Margaret smiled, her tears finally spilling over. "I told you I'd teach him how to make it," she said, her voice trembling with pride. David stood silently, watching as the moment unfolded, the tension of the day melting away. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, as though he had done something truly meaningful. And in that moment, the noisy world outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the quiet, timeless connection between two people who had shared something rare and beautiful. Life has a way of drawing lines between us, lines marked by differences in perspective, rooted in past experiences, or built upon misunderstandings that seem too deep to bridge. These divides can often feel insurmountable, leaving us isolated in our own beliefs, hesitant to reach across the gap. But every so often, something extraordinary happens. A story is shared, a memory is revived, or an act of kindness, small yet profound, reminds us of the threads that connect us all. The story of David, Margaret, and Donald Trump is one such reminder. It's a testament to the idea that compassion, humility, and love are not just qualities to admire but tools to heal. These virtues have the power to transform our relationships, soften our hearts, and allow us to see the humanity in one another, even when we seem worlds apart. In the midst of their differences, David was presented with a choice. It wasn't an easy one. Decisions that matter rarely are. He could have stayed rooted in his principles, turned away from the request, and let the moment pass. But instead, he chose to listen. And in doing so, he discovered something deeper, the ability of a shared meal, steeped in memory and care, to transcend the boundaries of politics, prejudice, and time itself. There's a lesson here for all of us. When we choose to approach others with empathy, to hear their stories and understand their journeys, we don't just create connections, we create meaning. It's in those moments, the ones born of understanding and vulnerability, that we grow. We learn that kindness doesn't require grand gestures. It often reveals itself in the smallest of ways: a quiet meal prepared with care, a hand extended in friendship, or a willingness to forgive. This story isn't just about a chef, an elderly woman, and a public figure. It's about all of us. It's a call to remember that at our core, we are more alike than we are different. We all carry memories that shape who we are, and we all long for moments of connection, for the kind of love that sees past our flaws and embraces our humanity. So, as you move through your own life, take this lesson with you. When you put your heart into what you do, you don't just create value. You create moments that last far beyond the present. These moments are what make life richer, what remind us that we are part of something larger than ourselves. May you always find joy in bringing happiness to others, even when it feels inconvenient or unacknowledged. True acts of kindness are rarely met with applause, but their echoes can be felt in ways you may never see. Remember, sometimes it's not the grand actions but the simplest ones: a smile, a meal, a listening ear, that make the most significant impact. And never forget that love, true, selfless, and unconditional, is often the secret ingredient in any recipe, be it for food, friendship, or a life well lived. Live, love, and share freely, because the best things in life aren't bound by status or circumstance. They're found in the quiet, unassuming moments that remind us what it means to be human.